A lot of Marvel Snap patches get criticized because they seem to be addressing the meta of a few weeks ago. This is by far the most in tune with the meta I have seen them be in a patch. It is a very interesting departure from what one would otherwise call the norm. I realize it's ridiculous to say that and then jump into a conversation about Doom 2099 gaining a power, but don't worry, this is still actually a nerf. And that is because of this. Effectively, what's happening is Doom 2099 is gaining 1 point of power, but DoomBot 2099s are losing a point of power. Given that the point of Doom 2099 is to make DoomBot 2099s, this is a nerf aimed pretty squarely at reducing the total output of this card when it's played too early, i.e. via Arishem, Psylocke, or Zabu. This has been the primary purpose of Doom 2099, and I think it's actually a fairly clever way at trying to address a card that may not actually necessarily be a huge problem, but has certain problematic use cases. I'm also of the theory that a card like Doom 2099, compared to something like Madam Web, the Move Bounce deck, is going to be much easier for them to see in the data as an issue because it is a much easier card to play. It's turn 3 and you have 4 energy, you play it, and then you play one card a turn the rest of the game. You don't even really have to worry about positioning from there because Doom 2099 is random and it sort of figures that stuff out for you. All of that is a recipe for a card that tends to have an overperformance among what you would describe average players as relative to the top end of Infinite. That is the normal profile for a card getting nerfed, and it makes a ton of sense that this is a card that they are reasonably interested in taking down a peg. Arishem, of course, no one's going to complain if that deck gets nerfed a little bit, but I think the real thing that probably pushed this over the limit was the fact that this Doom 2099 was sort of the core of the ongoing deck, which is an indicator, to me at least, of perhaps that this card is a little bit too strong, because anything that is able to make a deck with Spectrum playable really does start to make you wonder if this is a seriously reasonable thing. Spectrum, by the way, is another example of the theory I was talking about, where cards that are easier to play tend to have a much tighter leash from the balance team. I suspect that to be true, and I suspect that to be a part of why Doom 2099 got hit, and I suspect that will impact future decisions as well as some in this patch. The base theory, just to reiterate, is that I think that the easier a card is to play, the more it shows up in their data, because they're not looking at stats from the top 100, they're looking at stats from like the top 50% of all players, which is a wide range of people. And that means that anything that's easy to play is going to have a relatively inflated win rate, given that that's what they seem to be looking at. So because of that, I think Doom 2099 could reasonably be described as a victim of that. And that means that I expect that this will be a change that people will find welcome or maybe even lacking. I expect people to feel like this is a good, justified, and appropriate change, and I expect them maybe to even feel like it didn't go far enough. Because of how easy this card is to play, it becomes a bit of a terror, honestly, if you aren't fully prepared for it. It's a little too easy to just get too much out of what this card is giving you, and there's not a lot of work required to make it happen at all. That is why I would expect that this change is received either very positively, or if it is received negatively, it is only because people believe that it is not going far enough. As far as the card, I do not expect it to leave Arishem decks. I do not expect it to leave the ongoing decks, but I do expect those decks to get slightly worse, and that is usually a good reason to actually hit something with a nerf. If it's going to stay in the decks that it's already in, and those decks are still going to be pretty okay, and you can take those points off effectively for free, you should probably do it. Almost every single thing I just said, in my opinion, applies equally to Surtur. The addition of Sam Wilson freeing up some of the awkward draws that this deck had has made it basically one of the best decks in the metagame at all levels. According to the data set that they use, it was the best deck in the game based on the cohort that they look at. I don't know if I would necessarily agree with it being the best deck in the game. It's super high infinite, but it's definitely one of the top 5, I would say. And if you go lower than that, you start getting into the realm of it being very beneficial to have a deck that is easy to play like this and as strong as it is, such that I can very easily believe that in the cohort they're talking about, this was the best deck in the game and there wasn't a lot that people could do to actually deal with it. And I think that that is a really interesting and meaningful thing, because to me, dealing with Surtur usually meant being a deck that could afford to play Mobius. And there aren't a lot of decks that can really afford to do that, because let's say you're playing Mobius, great, they're playing a 3/16, you don't really care, like, yeah, it matters sometimes, but because Mobius has such a high bar to actually be included in a deck, because it needs so much of an engine around it, there actually aren't a ton of great places for Mobius to go in that are going to be able to compete on points even when they're stopping Skaar from coming down for free. And that, I think, is why they're worried about Surtur in this case. It's an extremely easy deck to play. It's hard to build and play the decks that are actually good into it, and they mostly haven't propagated outside of Top Infinite. This is a powerful, powerful card, and they're hitting it here by chopping the top off. No more 16 power Surturs. He is now capped at 11. Going to 3/5, still retaining the +3, so he is still going to be able to be a 3-cost card that will discount your Skaar, but frankly, I don't know if this is a good long-term solution. I would prefer them looking at Skaar, maybe. I do think that they aimed in the right spot. There are basically 2 real points to attack the Surtur Skaar deck on, and they are Surtur and Skaar. Anything else is sort of window dressing. If you start knocking down the 4/10s, they'll just play whatever the next best version of that is. And like, yeah, that matters, but not really. The cards that actually matter in the deck, the ones that spike your win rate, the ones that are the things that this deck really cares about doing, are this card and Skaar. So you have to do something. And I think keeping Surtur enabling Skaar as part of like the promise of the card is probably the right way to do it, although it does sort of make me think about this card as like more of a mistake than I previously had, because I previously was looking at this card as like, all right, well, at least it still gets to do its job, at least it's still able to be that. But if that's the only thing that it does, and I think it's worrying for me that really what this card is doing, this is an admission that the only thing it's here for is to be a 3 that scales to 10 so you get a free Skaar. That's it. This is a full admission of what this card is and is trying to do now. And I think that that's, I won't say it's a bad design decision. I think they're in a corner and they had to make some sort of decision about this. And I think doing something like reducing him to 3/3 and making him not enable Skaar at all is more of a betrayal of the ethos and identity of the card. But this is a very, I would guess, gameplay and metagame focused choice to make. It almost reminds me of when I was like trying to like propose that what they should do to Mockingbird originally was say Thanos stones don't work with this. And that's just like a very inelegant and inartful way of approaching a problem and trying to solve it. And I don't think it's as bad as that, but it does strike me notably as like, I think they're in a bad spot with this card. And I don't necessarily, if I were them, I wouldn't be happy with having to do this. All of that said, one of the more deserved nerfs we've had in a while. I don't think it'll massively impact how good the deck is, but Surtur's been interesting and weird where it gets hit a little bit and then drops off precipitously and then comes back with a vengeance when things are able to allow it to exist in that way again. It's odd. And I do think that Sam Wilson probably added a lot more to this deck than they thought it would. That's bluntly where I'm at with this, where it's like, yeah, I think they thought they might have to do this, but like because of Thaddeus Ross and having to do it because of Sam Wilson just making Cull Obsidian free, like that I think is the real thing that has brought this deck back into prominence. It doesn't really brick anymore. Like your worst draws still involve like a 4/10 and a 5/10 and then like a 2-cost 10 on the final turn of the game. Those are your bad draws now because your 4/10s are usually just going to always be playable. And that's bad, I think. And if you're looking at like a real issue with the deck, it's mostly that. But really what it is these cards where The deck wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Surtur and Skaar. You have to aim a nerf somewhere at one of those cards. I don't necessarily know that they made the right choice. Maybe you push Skaar up the cost, something like that. Maybe you make it reduce by less. Do something, right? But this is one of two viable nerfs for what is pretty clearly one of the best decks in the game. I'll be honest with y'all, I don't like this one. I think this is a nerf based on sort of play rate and general the amount of Wiccan that has been played since he came out, rather than a nerf based on his actual power. I frankly don't think this card is all that good right now, but they noted in the patch notes that the main thing they're talking about here is play rate, and I read a little into it. I think it's a little unsaid, but my interpretation of what they said was basically, we're sick of this guy being so centralizing in terms of play rate and defining what a mid-range curve-out deck is. And I think that's a fair thing to say. I just don't know why they didn't say that 2 to 3 months ago when it was also true. I don't know what about now makes you want to nerf Wiccan, basically. Like, it just feels like this is, of all the things that they've done that are like mildly out of touch, this is definitely one that feels where it's like, I don't even know if this deck is good right now. Like, I haven't really played a lot of good Wiccan decks recently. Like, they're always fine, but they're never great. And it's like, we just went through a metagame where like most mid-range decks were not really Wiccan decks. And we just came out of a metagame before that where like most mid-range decks were not really Wiccan decks. And it's just like, I don't really know if this is necessarily the time to do this. Evidently, their play rate stats suggest that it's fine, and I get it, right? Like, if you're just sick of seeing this guy around, I can understand taking a point of power off of him and making people who want to play him say, I really do want this card specifically. I'm not just playing it because it's the default option. It makes sense to me, but I don't like it because I feel like it's a little bit late. Like, I know I said at the beginning of the video, this is their most in-touch patch, and I really do think that it is. And the fact that this is such a departure from that, in my opinion, is why it stands out like this. I think this is a change that did not need to happen now, and I think it would have been fine to keep. And I wouldn't have argued against it if it happened a couple months ago, but right now it just sort of feels like I'm not really buying it. I think this is a really clever, subtle way to try to deal with Surtur and Skaar. And I really am interested to see if it works, because I don't know if you're going to be able to follow this. This is really high level and complex here. But if you play Scorpion, their 10 power stuff becomes 9 power. And then it doesn't actually turn on Skaar or Surtur. Go ho 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 ho. But I realize that like it's like a little obvious, right? Like, but I actually think it's pretty clever, where you now have a 2-card package of this card and Cassandra Nova that you can put in whatever curve out deck you feel like putting them into, and just let it be in whatever, and just play it with whatever else you're doing. Everything from like a Sera control deck, to a Wiccan deck, to a deck playing like Anti-Venom. All of these decks can now just like put this stuff in there and be like, oh, I'm actually like pretty reasonably likely to disrupt the 10s deck if I get one of these cards. And if I get 2 of these cards, they basically don't have any 10s in their entire deck, and they will never draw any 10s. And that's actually like a really like, that's kind of crazy, right? Like, you, again, like the method to attack the 10s deck is attacking Surtur and attacking Skaar. We've been trying Mobius, but honestly, it's possible we've been overlooking Scorpion, and this will put it back in the public eye. Like, Scorpion Cassandra Nova is like, wow, you actually just win. If you have like stats with that, you're just gonna win when you play those 2 cards. And I'm probably gonna put this guy in a lot of decks until people stop playing the 10s deck. Like, this is, they've done stuff like this before, right? Like when they tried to buff Shadow King in order to combat Agent Venom. That was stupid. That was bad. That was probably never gonna work. This is like, if that was smart, is sort of where I'm at. Like, this is like, I like where this is going. I think that is really clever. I think it is a really smart idea. And I think it's a really interesting thing that, in addition, like, maybe you have to push them to play Luke Cage now, and that's actually like kind of hard to actually fit in the deck. And if they're playing Luke Cage, you can just turn that thing off with Red Guardian, with stuff like Rogue. Really interesting stuff. I do worry that the only reason it wouldn't work is because of Luke Cage, where it's like, I do think this stuff is really clever and really interesting, but also if they're loot caging you, it's possible it won't matter all that much. But this is really good because one of the things that I've talked about with Mobius as a counter to this kind of Skaar stuff is that it's like, yeah, okay, you're Mobiusing me. I'm still playing bigger guys than you all of the time. And it's like, that's not an easy tech card to get into your deck. It's a 3/3. That's a large expenditure of energy for not a lot. And when you have a 2/3 and a 3/6 in the form of Scorpion Cassandra Nova, those are much more justifiably good cards. In fact, Scorpion's not even like a 2/3. It's a 2/3 plus whatever it is they play. Up to like 2/7 and then like a 3/6 that is actually like up to like a 3/10 or so. Like, this is a really good rate answer to really powerful stuff that is happening in this metagame. And it is good to give it a point of power and to remind everyone that it exists. I think this is one of the more impressive balance changes that they've made, both in terms of using their balance changes as a method of pointing us at cards that might be solutions to problems that we haven't thought about, and in terms of really creating good incentives towards going towards those solutions. Mobius is only a solution if you attach him to an engine that is already strong enough to compete with Skaar on points. Stuff like this helps you compete on points and also helps you solve the problem. It's really smart. A revert that has been long in the making, Sunspot gaining his 1 power back. I don't really need to tell you how long ago it was when this happened. You know it was forever ago, and you know it is at the very least justified that Sunspot gets his power back. It has been forever since this card was relevant. He was usually relevant as a method of smoothing out bad curves, occasionally in various Moon Girl She-Hulk and High Evo decks. All of that stuff is now totally non-existent. We have much better methods of smoothing out bad curves, from Kitty Pryde to Kate Bishop to God knows however many cards we have that are putting cards in your hand that you can then play. There are so many ways of making this card not be good enough for a 1-drop. It gets Killmongered, it gets Shadow King. This is a card that could probably be a 1-2 or a 1-3 before it actually started seeing serious metagame relevance. Giving it back its 1/1 to me feels like the barest minimum here. Like, just go whole hog with it. I realize they're unwilling to do that because Sunspot exists in Pool 1 and 2, and Pool 1 and 2 have to be balanced against each other in order to provide a welcoming and engaging new player experience. But if this card was like a Series 5 card, I'd be saying it was very underpowered and not worth your 6,000 tokens. I can tell you that much. Speaking of cards getting back a point of power that they lost more than a year ago, Sera going up to 5/5 again for the first time in a very long time. This is actually, I realize it's not the biggest deal in the world, but Sera decks are the kind of decks where 1 point of power really matters a lot, because the way Sera tends to play is that it is built on leveraging the smallest possible amount of power that it needs to win a lane, because it has so many powerful tech cards that can keep your opponent down below a certain level of points. And any point that Sera gets is going to be one that is valuable. This is also further compounded by the fact that when you look at utility 5-drops, they're not actually all that big. Utility 5-drops in Marvel Snap, I'm using as like a pretty wide range of cards here, but what I mean is like your Legions, your Visions, stuff like that, right? Sera is at 5/4, basically usually too small enough to be considered one of those. At 5/5, she might still be a little too small to be considered one of those, but like, let's say you're playing an Arishem deck. Is she really going to be all that much worse than Legion? Maybe. I mean, I think Legion has a lot of cube equity in that deck, and I don't really want to cut him because that's one of the few decks where I can actually justify running Legion. But like, let's say you're playing a mid-range deck and you want to play Legion. You could actually just play Sera instead. The more stats she gets, the closer she becomes to like being a generically applicable mid-range card. I'm not saying that's always going to happen. I'm not saying that's what she's going to be. But I am saying she took a large step closer to the cohort of her peers, that is Legion and Vision and things like that. And frankly, if she was a 5/6, I'd kind of wonder if she wasn't already up there with them as one of the better generic 5 drops in the entire game. And I don't necessarily have a ton of respect for Sera Control, the archetype, so much, which is sort of why I would like to see her be one of those more generically applied 5 drops. It's possible that this actually does make it happen for her. Adam Warlock has had such a weird run where originally he was like one of, if not the worst cards in the game at 2-0 with his old ability. Then he went to 5-5 and he was one of the worst cards in the game, but like slightly better. Like you go from like a 25% win rate to a 30% win rate. You move from unplayable to unplayable. But as much as you would like to call that an improvement, there were a bunch of people who really liked the ability to play old Adam Warlock, who really loved the ability to like cope this pretty terrible, awful card. And I think this is a really interesting way of approaching trying to make the card stronger, because what they've done is give him back his old ability and stat line, except if he doesn't draw a card, he gains a point of power, which helps you get towards drawing a card because then it gets you closer to winning there. Which is a really interesting and cool way to try to play him. Here's the problem. I think a lot of when people talk about old Adam Warlock, what they loved was like playing him in Cerebro after Abast, and he is now not a playable card in Cerebro. But here's where he might be playable, is that Anti-Venom Havoc deck. That's a deck that could use a guy that starts at 3 and scales up 1 each turn when he's not drawing you a card. I'm not saying there's a guaranteed hit for him here, but that's not a terrible use for an Adam Warlock on day 1. I don't know if he'll make the final cut in that deck. It's entirely possible that he won't, but there is more of a desire for me to play Adam Warlock in a deck that isn't terrible because of this new text than there ever has been before. And that is really interesting. But what I'm wondering is, because Adam Warlock, in my mind, was so tied to Cerebro, is that like a personal thing? Or are the people who really loved old Adam Warlock just going to get mad at this because they can't play it in Cerebro because it gains the power? I don't know. Like, I'm really interested in finding out, because this is definitely an unplayable card in Cerebro. Like, come on. And so this is a card that is just sort of sitting there, either doing something really cool in a deck that isn't Cerebro or doing nothing. And I'm almost sort of thinking that this might be yet another failed Adam rework. He's in a better spot than he was, but I kind of wonder if this isn't actually giving the old Adam fans what they really wanted, which was Bast Cerebro, and instead he's just going to be this card that is like the 13th best card in the AV Havoc deck, and there's probably a better option in your collection. I don't know. I feel like people are going to expect this, like they're going to have a lot of high hopes for it, and then they're going to play it, and they're going to be like, oh, this still sucks. And so that is ultimately my worry here, is that they get an Adam Warlock, so they move from 25% to 30%. Now they're going to go to like a 45% win rate, but people are still going to hate it, and then they won't be able to play it in their meme Cerebro decks. It's crazy. It's crazy. I almost feel like it's the same mistake happening over again. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KM Best. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one. Let me know what you thought of this patch in the comments. I still read all the comments, much to the detriment of my mental health and my perception of myself. Thank you so much. You have been phenomenal. I'll see you next time.